thank you for being here. I'll just read out the short bio Thato has shared with us. Thato is a doctoral, Thato Magano is that how you say it? Magano?
It's a Haraji, but it's fine. Like
Okay. Makano. Sorry about that. Is a doctoral candidate in the program in the comparative literature at Rutgers University and in medieval and early modern studies at Leiden University's Center for the Arts and Society at the Universiteit Leiden. Thato's doctoral research reconsiders the utility of sodomy in the Dutch Empire to demonstrate how its cultural and social logics were foundational to Dutch identity, as were any of its founding mythologies in the Republic and its transoceanic world. I won't read out the abstract. We have shared that, and Thato's title for today's talk is Sex, Sin, Desire, and the Homosexual Species at the Cape of Good Hope. Thank you, Thato, for being with us, and please take it away.
All right.
I'll just put my video off just to facilitate the with the bandwidth if there isn't a bandwidth problem.
I'm gonna share my screen, and there, everybody can see the presentation.
Yes, I can see it. I hope everybody else can see it. Yeah.
Great. Well, I just want to start off by saying thank you to Dr. Masola for tracking me down one Friday afternoon and insisting that I send her my details so that I could present a seminar at this forum, and Dr. Sen for the ease with which you facilitated the process, and Alicia earlier today for helping me prepare, and to everybody else for attending. Slightly processing some nerves because you are the first audience ever to encounter this work outside of my small intimate community of advisors. Professor Andrew Parker, who is attending this seminar, I suppose, has woken up early to be able to make it as well. And yeah, that's really it. I want to start off by saying that this is an excerpt of the first chapter of my dissertation. The dissertation titled Sodomy's Golden Age, Sodomitical Assemblages in the 17th century Dutch Empire. The project really is a consideration of sodomy's cultural and social relevance in the 17th century Dutch Empire. And I make a series of moves to show how sodomy functioned in the 17th century as a floating signifier of sin and other kinds of social transgressions. It's structured in 4 chapters. In the first 2 chapters, I pursue same-sex relations and a racialization problem in regards to sodomy. And in chapter 3, I go to the island of New Amsterdam, which is New York City today, to think about the relationship of the African Creoles who lived in New Amsterdam with Dutch burghers. And then in the final chapter, I turn to Amsterdam itself and think about the gendered manifestations of sodomy in the 17th century. And so that's really the dissertation broadly. And the presentation today is structured in 2 sections. One, I present the stakes of the arguments and interventions that I make in this chapter, and then I present the evidence and the argument that I make, right? So I will begin. Sex, Sin, Desire, and the Homosexual Species at the Cape of Good Hope. On the stretch of road eponymously named Castle Street, the short distance between Krotoa Place and Burg Street, 3 pentagonals embellished with bronze plates depicting one of the world's oldest logos are shaped onto the paved stretch of road. The Verenigde Oost-Indische Campagne's monograms shimmer in the joy of their intent to mark the enduring legacy of the Dutch settlement at Earth's extremist end. A prototype of fortifications in the Dutch Republic since the mid-16th century, The pentagonals imprint the first permanently built colonial structure in the Cape, the Castle of Good Hope, into the city's landscape. The middle of the three is placed directly at the entrance to one of the city's oldest and market-leading adult entertainment brands, Adult World. The store, the second oldest since the brand began in 1997, was established in 2001 at the advent of the struggle for gay marriage legalization in South Africa. The Netherlands legalized same-sex marriage in 2001, and South Africa followed 5 years later in 2006, earning the distinctions of being the first in Europe and in the world, and the first on the African continent, respectively. Amsterdam's reputation as one of the world's most vibrant and inclusive gay destinations is paralleled by Cape Town as Africa's gay tourism capital. The alchemy of the VOC logo, the pentagonals, and the adult store continues to entwine the Dutch Republic and the Cape Colony in histories of conquest and commerce, just as they do Amsterdam and Cape Town's mainstreamed progress narratives on sexuality. On March 28, 1658, the Dutch vessel Amersfoort, after 5 months sailing the Atlantic, serendipitously anchored a novel predicament at the Cape. On January 8th and 16th, the ship's council had held and concluded an inquisition into allegations of the sodomite sins against the cook, Thomas Pillman. The council had extracted a confession from the 15-year-old Johan Joritse van Amsterdam that the cook had given Joritse his manliness while requesting the sodomite sin, and that he, Joritse, did not know what it meant. The cook had also taken Joritse's manliness, even though he had not given Pillman permission to do so. Joritse admitted that the cook had done it to him at the back or the rear between his legs, and pleaded with the council for forgiveness on account of his youth and honesty. On January 23rd, after extracting 2 confessions from Pillman under torture, the council resolved to defer judgment to the VOC council at the Cape. At the Adult World on Castle Street, 2 doors await those inducted into the secret world of men in the bowels of the city. One leads to the bathrooms, while the other takes you to a lounge in the basement where a makeshift maze enfolds desire, exploration, experimentation, freedom, and anonymity. Unbeknownst to many, in this murkily lit labyrinth of makeshift rooms fitted with antique TV, VCR combo television units, blurring hetero and homosexual pornographic images and sounds, and glory hole stands, quote unquote gay men enact a shielded homosocial contract as the city hums on above. On December 15th, 1717, Adam Fichler was accused as the chief ringleader and seducer. Through cunning and a devilish inspiration, he had turned 3 other men to his will in order to satisfy his wanton passions in an unnatural way. And these 3 men had allowed themselves to be used as tools. In the Nassau bastion of the Castle of Good Hope, the fiscal had demanded that Fichler, along with the messenger of the court, Jan Tienes of Groningen, and the sailor, Peter Andrets Fritz of Haarlem, be taken to a ship in the roads and drowned alive by the executioner after satisfying himself that all 3 had fully performed the sodomitical sin. While 4 men had been accused of sexual acts with Fichler, the soldiers Nicholas Friedrich Einfeld of Hanover and Jan de Breker of Gorkum escaped the penalty. Einfeld would be severely whipped in secret for having consented to attempted sodomy, while de Breker had firmly denied the accusations and was eventually freed from his detention. In 1658, it is likely that due to misrouting, the Amersfoort would have docked some walking distance from where the Cape Castle Adult World is located, 1 block away from Strand Street. Only a shoreline in the 17th century, the 21st century Strand Street is now littered with high-rise infrastructure developments. In 1658, the decks of a vessel would bring to the Cape its first criminalization of a same-sex sexual encounter, while today, the bowels of the city, like the Nassau bastion of the castle in 1717, permits underground rendezvous where same-sex encounters and other types of homosocial intimacies find exploration. Enlightened by Isabel Hofmeyer's concept of hydrocolonialism as a scholarly practice in the wake of post-colonialism committed to exploring imperial uses of the oceans or bodies of water by European empires and their aftermaths, I follow these moments in the underbellies of the ocean onto and in the mainland to explore how sodomy has been engaged in normative discourses of sexuality in the region. Dutch Golden Age scholarship on sodomy is founded on two arguments advanced by Theo van der Meer's groundbreaking study, Sodom's Seed in the Netherlands, the emergence of homosexuality in the early modern period. First, it is that the 1730 sodomy trials that followed the discovery of an intricate social network of male same-sex behaviors were part of a growing homosexual awareness in Northwestern Europe in the late 17th century. Secondly, while acknowledging and discounting the minimal instances where sodomy appeared as an unstable referent of sin and crime, the scholarship argues that discourses on sodomy were absent in the Republic before the 1730 trials. It was the 1730 juridical processes that produced historically positivist articulations of sodomy as a stabilized referent of male homosexual behavior and as a social discourse of sin. In this paper, I depart from the 1730 trials and the dawn of homosexual identity to focus on the understudied manifestations of sodomy in the long 17th century and trouble the notion that discourses on sodomy only emerged after the 1730 trials. Revisiting Andre M. van Rensburg's The Amersfoort and Susie Newton King's For the Love of Adam, two sodomy trials at the Cape of Good Hope, I meditate on the relationship between the compound sodomite sins and the juridical category of sodomy. I contrast Van Rensburg and Newton King's interpretations of the 1658 and 1717 trials to reconsider the hydrocolonial renderings of sodomy in my pursuit of a Dutch empire saturated by sodomitical discourses from the earliest decades of its maritime glory. I embrace Leo Boehm's definition of early modern sodomite sins as any moral failing that was considered offensive against God, human nature, and dignity, and the sodomite as someone who had willingly debased themselves by temporarily obviating God's commandments. In this early modern context, all sin was sodomitical as sinners were trespassers into the forbidden. However, same-sex sexual sins were understood as the quintessential transient aberration into the forbidden. In my formulation, I divert from Boehm's characterization of the sodomite as only the individual who engaged in same-sex sexual behaviors to demonstrate how the juridical definition of sodomy has subsumed early modern discourses of sodomy in the Dutch Republic and its transoceanic world. Jonathan Goldberg's formulation of sodomy as a nonce word suggestiveness orients my analysis on sodomy's inherent dualities, which Michel Foucault describes as utterly confused, and how sodomy was mobilized socially and culturally in the Dutch Empire. As a cultural concept, sodomy is a catachristic variable intended to name something, yet never fully capturing the reality of the thing it names. As Goldberg suggests, sodomy is a relational term and one whose geometry we do not know, but one whose asymmetries we need to or must explore. Its cultural utility is in its capacious vacuousness to name all that is wrong, as it can only be legible through what is said or not said, making itself available for a variety of simultaneous inflections. Understanding sodomy is a concept without content, and one that is speculative in character. I am interested in how its subjunctive potential was instrumentalized as a relational category that named and pursued sin and criminality prior to its juridical designation after the 1730 trials. Moving away from the homosexual emergence narrative of the 1730 trials, I propose instead the nomenclature, sodomitical assemblages, to mark the locations where the variabilities of sodomy were made visible in relation to Burqa identity. By drawing our attention to these variabilities, I argue that sodomy marked all human actions that transgressed the bounds of socially normative hierarchies, while also revealing the inconsistencies and falsehoods of those normative hierarchies. Viewed as an assemblage rather than as a marker of homosexual identity, I unveil sodomy's floating status as a signifier that was never settled and was always shifting in relation to the discourses that animated it. In the Amos Fort, we learn that 6 witnesses ranging the ages of 15 to 27 were called to give testimony against the cook, 4 stating their allegations, 1 corroborating the narratives, and 1 coerced into a confession. The cook's strategies for enticing and or harassing his victims ranged from innocuous offers of food to the use of physical threat and intimidation. The consistent strategy was the offer to share his bed instead of a chest or a hammock. The Amos Fort declares Pullman as the gay cook on board and considers if Pullman's actions warrant him culpable of pedophilia. To arrive at this conclusion, Van Rensburg's analysis of the case neglects a critical moment in Pullman's inquisition when he is asked whether he had learned this behavior on the streets of Amsterdam, to which he had responded that he had never done it previously. For the Love of Adam equally makes the case for a normative homosexual identity by transforming Adam Ficheler into one of Cape Town's first gay men. 7 soldiers had testified to 2 instances of the unnatural sin of sodomy involving Ficheler. The first was between the 2 soldiers, Ficheler and Einfeld, and the second was between Ficheler and the sailor, Fritz. Ficheler and Einfeld had committed this odious crime in broad daylight on Einfeld's bed and were seen in flagrante delicto by their barrack maids, who then complained to the sergeant in charge. The sergeant had only advised Einfeld to return to his bed at night, and nothing more was made of the complaint. With Fritz, Ficheler had brought the sailor into the guardroom and passed him off as a soldier. They were heard making love in the middle of the night, sighing and kissing, and moving as man and wife. Making love once more after a conversation in the silence of the night, Ficheler was heard saying, sweet pity, you have no troubles, I take them all on me." Newton King considers whether the spontaneous, ebullient, and consensual sexuality of Adam Ficheler and his companions was a demonstration of the homosexual self-awareness emerging in Europe. To make the case for the gay male, Van Rensburg and Newton King turn to the compromised histories of sexual deviance in Western representations in the advent of queer theory in the late 20th century. Scholars of queer theory, following Michel Foucault's The History of Sexuality, engendered a desire to reframe how supposed deviant desires and sexualities were doomed to tragedy by appealing to violence and stigmatization to affirm the legitimacy of gay and lesbian existence. Scholars accrued historical narratives with complex significations that blurred the boundaries between representations of historical fact and personal desires to advance a triumphalist view of same-sex histories. These desires continue to dominate the historiographies of sexuality as the 2 cases present. The positivist archival reconstructions of the 1730 trials ushered a critique of Foucault's argument that the homosexual was a species invented by the sexological, medical, and criminal discourses of the late 19th century. As Foucault argued, where the sodomite had been the subject of a transient social transgression, the 19th century discourses transformed this discursive profile into the homosexual as species. In a critique of Foucault, Theo van der Meer argued that the privileging of these discourses overlooked human agency in directing desire. And while they did indicate how desire was structured, they hardly engaged homosexual desires in their cultural and historical, or in their ontological and psychological contexts. Van der Meer's argument is that the transformations in social relations in Northwestern Europe since the late 17th century had resulted in an affective individualism that set in motion the emergence of the modern individual. This individualism transformed men with same-sex desires from will-less recipients of meanings into generators of new social symbolisms, marking their homosexual awareness as a discursive resistance to the political and economic tensions caused by the hierarchical social systems of early modern Europe. As incisive an intervention van der Meer's formulations present, I take the cue from his exemplary caution to meditate on the cultural, historical, ontological, and psychological contexts informing Pullman and Fichelaar's incidents. In an alternate reading of the Amersfoort and For the Love of Adam, I argue that Van Rensburg and Newton King's analysis privilege the specificities of the 1730 trials and results in a self-referential colony that can only know itself through its colonizers. I intervene here to argue that the cultural, juridical, and historical contexts of the early modern Dutch Republic warrant the consideration of a transoceanic geography to adequately reflect the transformations of the Golden Age. I trouble the essentializing tropes of the Dutch enigma that was founded by 19th century historiographies to demonstrate how the lauded successes of the Republic were a direct result of networks of movement between the Republic, its empire, and its broader Atlantic world. By demonstrating complex sodomitical networks in these geographies, I argue that sodomy was a discourse of power utilized in the formation of Burger identity in the Republic and its transoceanic worlds. These transoceanic geographies, the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, the Cape of Good Hope and Batavia, are representative of the early modern world's social dynamic, where a skewed sex ratio was the reality. VOC seafaring was a male-centric activity, and seaports and harbors in the Cape and Batavia were dominated by men in the employ of the VOC or migrants looking for varied economic opportunities. The skewed sex ratio facilitated same-sex intimate arrangements by men navigating the harsh and alienating realities of maritime and nascent settler colonial life. In maritime life, Richard Burke's evidence of shipboard sexual narratives show how clerical accounts were dominated by defenses from officers and senior personnel on charges of consensually performing the sodomite sin on each other or under duress on resistant ship boys. The cultural logics of the ships ensured that those in positions of authority chose their pick among the boys who were in the minorities. Ship boys formed about 10% of a ship's crew and were in the lowest tiers of the naval hierarchy. They were the central focus of seaborne sexuality, Burke argues. The commonplace historical knowledge of hierarchical shipboard sex is a function of the recorded complaints received from boys who had been forced into sexual acts. Pertaining to officers who likely performed sodomite sins consensually, there is not the same abundance of clerical data to provide a complex consideration of maritime sex life that is not overdetermined by hierarchical coercive sexual practices. With the available evidence, Burke demonstrates a more complex sexual economy that included ordinary sailors finding erotic and sexual partners among their rank or with shipboys, and instances where shipboys found sexual congress with each other or with officers and senior personnel. In settler colonies, alternative forms of social relations had been present since the earliest days of European seafaring. Alexandre Olivier Equimelin's highly popular 1678 journal, The History of the American Buccaneers, details the manner of living, customs, and ordinary employments of the French buccaneers living in Tortuga on the island of Hispaniola from as early as 1644. Ecumelin observed that the buccaneers followed in a general and solemn common practice of matelotage, comradeship or seamanship. The formalized ritual of coupling one buccaneer and another male was described as an essential part of buccaneer life, to choose a comrade or companion, a partner, and join their properties for mutual and reciprocal gain, and legally attesting the surviving companion absolute heir. While Ecumelin describes experiences in the Caribbean islands, institutional arrangements that joined male partners together were a common seafaring and settler occurrence, even as the rarity of recorded sources might otherwise suggest. And in the larger chapter, I detail several examples of these kinds of arrangements in New Amsterdam, and I will be looking for further evidence in other places of the Dutch Empire. The significance of these arrangements is largely subsumed by interpretations of their sentimentality as romantic love. David Halpern cautions that we must see how this affective economy was structured by Platonic affects that produced joined identities, unwilling to live without the other, ready to die with or for the other. The objective, Halpern argues, was to mark each other as the same, with the sameness of rank and status, the sameness of sentiment, and the sameness of identity. Alan Bray counsels on the slippages to be encountered, though, in the stark renderings of intimacies between men and the forbidden intimacies of homosexuality. Bray reminds us of the ambiguities that are inherent in the social structure of male friendships to enable the performance of same-sex relations without suspicion. It is in these ambiguities that we can lift the veil of heterocentrist social norms and see how the alchemy of these conventions is available to alternative manipulation. These manipulations are apparent in the case of Joost Schouten's sensational execution by strangulation and burning on July 11, 1644 in Batavia. Schouten, for whom Schouten Island was named, was a member of the Council of the Indies, the body to which only the ablest VOC servants belonged, had confessed to a same-sex network of over 20 men across VOC establishments in Asia. Schouten had established himself as a wealthy man, famous and powerful, and a leading member of Batavian society, and was likely to become the next Governor General. On the evening of July 8th, Schouten was intercepted in his bedroom while trying again to persuade a young Frenchman in the usual way, and at the frustration of his continuing refusal, he had given him some Chinese brocades while pushing him towards the bed where he wished to caress him. At that moment, 2 VOC officials came from behind his bed and caught him by the collar, and he was straight away taken to jail. It had been a carefully constructed ruse to catch Schouten in flagrante delicto after the Frenchmen had complained to the Governor General about Schouten's advances. The 40-something-year-old Schouten voluntarily confessed that he had allowed himself to be used like a woman, always in the passive role and never the active one, although he had tried to play the latter role several times, but without success. The list of accomplices and geographies in Schouten's network was wide and ranging. Boatswain's mates, skippers, soldiers, and burghers traversing India, Batavia, Siam, Malacca, and Aceh. Schouten further confessed that he had started these behaviors before his return to the Republic in 1636 and had continued them after his return in 1639. Like Adam Fichler, Schouten was indicted of gruesome sodomy, of being a hypocritical villain and seducer of many, who had used his position and influence to lead others astray in satisfying his devilish lechery. Gossip networks were alight with suggestions that Schouten had had a disdainful reputation towards the other sex. The women of Batavia had called him a ruffian, and the allegations were no surprise to them, as he hadn't married because he had no love for their sex. For the council, it was evident that the divine order had been offended and the guilty parties had to be punished, and Schouten more so, because he had been a judge for many years and knew the consequences of the abominable and atrocious sodomitic sin in the eyes of God and the people. The Council of the Indies had written to the VOC Board of Directors in Amsterdam, the Gentlemen 17, in their annual general letter about their sodomitic colleagues and their hope to be spared from God's wrath for harboring such colleagues. Gijsbert Hierk's 1665 journal, Back to the East, The Journey of VOC Surgeon Gijsbert Hierk, 1654 to 1656, contained an eyewitness account of the execution. To his prospective reader, Hierk noted, Schouten was strangled and burned to ashes in my presence in Batavia, since he was unworthy to continue living among humans, which is a fitting recompense and retribution for his gruesome life on earth. These secular movements, seafaring sexual practices, Equimelin's Buccaneer narratives, Schouten's travels, and the news of his execution would be received by a Dutch Republic ravenous for news of its transoceanic worlds. Michel van Groossen has shown that rumors, news, spin doctrine, and propaganda were germane to the construction of burgerlijkheid across government and social settings, at public meetings, inside private homes, and on the streets. Because of the Republic's urban-based burger class, social life revolved around cities and the elites. Urban populations lived physically closer to those in power, and this proximity raised the levels of popular participation in politics and the effectiveness of public opinion. What discourses did the narrative of Schouten's execution generate? And how did they influence VOC officials across the oceans? When the Council of the Amersfoort asked Pullman about his knowledge of the sodomitic sin and whether it had come from the streets of Amsterdam, would they have been privy to the types of activities Schouten might have also carried out in the streets of the city during his 1637 to 1639 return to the Republic? And if Schouten did in fact practice the sodomite sins in the Republic, where and how would he have done so? And how did he know that his secrets would be kept safe? If VOC officials already knew that some men engaged in egalitarian same-sex acts in the streets of Amsterdam from as early as the 1630s, what would this mean for Figelara's execution nearly a century later? How did their knowledge of matlotage affect their adjudication of Figelara's actions because of European perceptions about the unfettered homosexuality among the buccaneers? Could it have been that Figelar and his accused were executed not because they transgressed the common hierarchical sexual practice, but that it was because of the council's familiarity with the potential dangers of Figelar's sexual economy? What could have been the calculations that the VOC Council were making about Figelar's disruptive sexual practices on the social order and its likelihood to engender civil disobedience? Excessive alcohol consumption was as constitutive to Dutch gastronomy as was maritime trade. Drunkenness and femininity were conscripted into the Republic's sin economy. The slippery slope between sin and civil disobedience was a quintessential 17th century concern. Benjamin Roberts demonstrates how, since the earliest decades of the 17th century, moralists were fixated on the idea of excessive alcohol drinking as the gateway to social disorder. The concern was that drunkenness led to the sin of gluttony, and this greed might express itself through premarital sex or in violent activities if one had too much leisure time. Warning about the dangers of the 20-30 phenomenon, excessive drinking and promiscuity, they argued that excessive drinking led to the descent of men into the realm of femininity when they could not control their drink. In this economy, a loss of control was identical to a loss of masculinity. Rereading van Rensburg's archival reconstruction in the Amersfoort, a neglected piece of evidence directs us to the assemblages that informed Pullman's inquisition. One of the six witnesses, 27-year-old Herman Simons van Bremen, testified that Pullman was already in jail for drinking and being drunk the day before the Inquisition started. Pullman had asked him to persuade his accuser, 16-year-old Jan Bedrecht van Bergen op Zoom, to change his story because he was facing death. Pullman knew that he had not been apprehended in flagrante delicto. Asking Bedrecht to change his story would result in no direct accuser, and there would be no reason for him to be in jail. It was already extraordinary that Pullman was in jail for excessive drinking, given how quotidian alcohol was to Berger identity. The ship's counsel's surveillance suggests that they were aware of how Pullman was using rations to lure his victims. The VOC had a reputation for terrible pay and equally terrible food supply. This was one of the causes of their commercial success. Many skippers found their way around this problem by economizing on the crew's rations and selling the surplus on arrival at Batavia. Pullman's wastefulness with food and drink had clearly been surveilled, and Bedrecht's complaint had presented the site of an assemblage. VOC officers were known for their ruthless and violent command and often taking liberties with punishments. Things had gotten to a state where the VOC chamber had instituted a fine of 6 months' wages for the first offense and discharge with ignominy for the second. It is likely that the Amersfoort's council had all of these concerns in mind and knew that they needed a legitimate crime to deal with Pullman's insolence. The sodomitical assemblage of excessive drinking and wastefulness and the possibility of same-sex acts resulted in an inquisition to produce the truth needed to assemble the crime of sodomy. In Fichelaar's case, the crisis that femininity presented to the construction of Berger masculinity is explicit. Fichelaar and his accused, like Joost Schouten in 1644, had allowed themselves to be used like women and disrupted the masculinity matrix. Fichelaar had been reckless by bringing a sailor into the castle barracks and passing him off as a soldier. Sailors had a reputation for unruliness, ill discipline, and violence, and they coexisted with soldiers whose very existence depended on the greatest exercise of discipline and order. I agree with Newton King that Fichelaar's manipulation of the circumstances of his relationship and reckless favor with Fritz did not endear him to his fellow barrack mates. After this incident, his barrack mates, Fichelaar's barrack mates, sidestepped the sergeant and appeared directly before the fiscal's office to lodge their complaint. The illegible and very real threats of a pervasive femininity and transgressions of the social order were assembled with same-sex acts and were legitimized as the juridical charge of sodomy to eradicate the threat posed by Fichelaar's actions. And so I'm concluding now. I argue that the histories of sexuality as produced by the Amersfoort and For the Love of Adam are sodomitical in their pursuit of the homosexual as species. Arguing for homosexual identity, they assemble around and outside, not with and through maritime and settler colonial sexual cultures in favor of the empiricist foundations of sexuality in Europe. I make the case that the histories of sexuality produced by Golden Age scholarship on sodomy in the Dutch Republic are themselves sodomitical in their exclusion of Europe's transoceanic worlds while claiming a universality to European history. They elide how the sodomite and their sodomite sins were co-opted into discourses of burgerlijkheid and nation-making to construct sodomy's juridical presence since the earliest conceptions of the Dutch Republic and its transoceanic worlds. True to its utterly confused nature, sodomy inhabited a collectivity of transgressions that were assembled into language and social performance that was as obscure as it is transparent. It was transcendent as a speculative social technology that was instrumentalized with legal consequence while simultaneously displacing and claiming same-sex acts as the only sodomite sin. And thank you.
So much, Thato. That was fascinating. So we have a good 20 minutes for presentations. Mandisa already has her hands raised, but just in terms of just if you can just raise your hands using the hand tool at the Zoom, or you can just ask the question and put your video on, whatever is more comfortable. Please go ahead, Mandisa.
Thank you for a very rich paper. I've got two very simple questions. One is about embodiment. So the same-sex practicing men's experiences and subjective senses of their own bodies, and whether you can get at that in your sources. The other concerns venereal disease, which is something that's been written about in many contexts as regards same-sex practicing men and also cis heterosexual men linked to militaries and ports. And then it takes me to a final question, which is, what do you think are some of the limitations of your sources in terms of showing same-sex practicing men's own understanding of their sexual experiences?
Shall I respond?
You respond? I don't see any hands right now, up right now. Carolyn has a question. So maybe take Carolyn's question. We'll take two questions and then you can respond and then we'll have another round. Please go ahead, Carolyn.
Well, thanks very much. Just because this particular question relates quite closely to Mandisa's question, and that's, I'm curious about the extent to which any of the records, and ship records in particular, medical records, give you any openings at all. So very much linked to Mandisa's question. Thanks.
Yeah. Well,
thank you for that, Carolyn.
Yeah, well, thank you for very fascinating questions and just getting me to think a little bit. I want to say this. I think what I am pursuing in this dissertation is sodomy's location as a discourse, right? And not as a marker of homosexual identity, right? And so I am not in, I am less interested in questions of embodiment around same-sex acts and how that might translate into homosexual identity, right? And so, which is why I make the pivot from the kinds of empiricist, positivist articulations of sodomy, right? So and I suppose maybe this answers all these three questions in one, in that what I'm pursuing is the ways in which the cultural understanding of sodomy is used relationally to same-sex acts, right? And so how are these kinds of discourses showing up to construct sodomy as a juridical category, right? That always assumes same-sex acts as part of its matrix in order to be legally legible, right? And so in the sources, I am explicitly pursuing the kinds of cultural understandings, right? So in this chapter, really, the discourse is around foundations of Burgher identity. And so what were the discourses of Burgher surrounding Burgher identity, right? And so as I state here, excessive drinking, femininity, masculinity, right? And so, and what were the threats to Burgher, the construction of Burgher identity, right? And so, you know, how do these threats show up to construct the category of sodomy through its legal as a legal category, rather. And I don't know if that answers all of your questions, but you know, I am not so invested in the pursuit of embodied same-sex practice as a way towards identifying homosexual identity.
Carolyn, Thato has a follow-up in the chat. Maybe you can, you don't need to respond to it immediately, but I just wanted to alert you to that. Susan wants to ask a question, but she doesn't have a mic or a camera, so she's going to type it out in the chat. While she's doing that, other questions, comments? Please go ahead. There is a comment, Thato, in the chat box, Susan.
These recorded trials seem to concern company officials. Is burqa identity relevant here? Well, the argument I'm making is about the construction of burqa-ness, right? And so burqa as a kind of social relation, right? And so that would involve everyone in the kind of Dutch Empire, right? And so how does burgerlijkheid as a social system, or how is burgerlijkheid as a social system practiced, right? So that's one thing. And that would mean that even those who have not become burgers are subject to the conditions that construct burgerlijkheid, right? And then obviously there is, the case of Schouten is the most quintessential example of what would happen to a burger, and particularly the type of burger that Schouten was, right? He had been very successful and had an island named after him in Tanzania. And so, the crisis here is about the kind of construction of a nation, right? So the desire to construct a nation, and what were the kinds of foundational ethics that constructed this idea of a nation.
Sorry, Carolyn, is that an old hand, or do you want to ask another question?
Sorry, it's an old hand. I beg your pardon.
Okay. Questions, comments? Justin.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the paper. It was really, really fascinating. I just want to ask, I'm really interested in your decision to separate sodomy from gay identity. And I was wondering if you could say a bit more about that, particularly because I think that is not new. That has a long history, doesn't it? This sort of, and it sort of speaks to wider issues of masculinity and patriarchy. So I'm not being very clear, but I think, I mean, your paper is clearly historical, but have you made any links to, the contemporary kind of setup where there are people who advocate for certain types of identities and who insist on certain things, and then you get other people who say where there are these sort of lines that you can't cross, that it's okay to be gay, but you don't do this. So I'm just wondering how, it's not very clear, I'm sorry, but I'm wondering if you comment and if you've made any connections with.
Thanks, Justin. There is also, Thato, I think Susan has a follow-up comment in the chat. So if you want to, I don't know if you want to engage with that as well. I have a question, but I'll come after this.
So Susan says not sure about that. Company officials did interact with burgers, of course, and intermarry, but their reference points tended to be with one another and with their principles in Europe. I'm not really sure what the comment is meant to do, because I think that's the point I am making, right? That, I mean, I think perhaps company officials are burgers also, right? And perhaps maybe we mean sailors and soldiers who are not burgers per se, but they are subject to the conditions upon which burgerlijkheid is formed, right? And so that there are two things moving here, that burger is a kind of official citizen status, but burgerlijkheid is a kind of social institution that everybody should participate in, right? And so that these things are moving together always at the same time, right? And then to Justin's question, I mean, I think, Justin, so for me, I think part of my work reflects the transition in perhaps queer studies as an umbrella term for the work that I'm doing, right? That it makes sense that, you know, Theo van der Meer's work came out in the late 20th century, right? Post-Foucault, where this kind of positivist iterations of same-sex acts, right, that would be translated into homosexuality was prevalent, right? And so that in this kind of early 21st century moment where many of us are saying that, well, these categories are social constructions and they don't do the work that we have been told that they are supposed to do, right? And so I think even for me personally, right, just to share a personal anecdote, I have chosen to go by the pronoun Thato, which is my name, and partly because he, she, they are clearly social designations that are constructed, which don't make any sense to me, right? And so my name is something that I choose for myself. And so I want that to be the ways in which I'm being addressed, right? And so I have an affinity towards sodomites of the early modern world versus homosexuals of the early modern world, because sodomite is a broad category that could include anyone who seemingly did not participate in ways that were in accordance with conventional social norms, right? And constructed social norms. And so I suppose maybe what I'm getting at here is that all of these things are fictions, right? They are fictions. And so how might we negotiate around these fictions? And so for me, it is perhaps maybe we need to, all of us must have their own category, or perhaps we are all sodomites. And I think that's part of maybe what I'm trying to recuperate, the ways in which sodomy has been lost to the legal fraternity in the humanities, right? And so what I didn't mention is that there's a kind of also meta framework here where I am investigating the uses of sodomy as a method of doing intellectual work, right? You know, scholars, from what I have read, we have privileged sodomy to the legal fraternity, and particularly in literary scholarship, no one has other kinds of methodological interventions that draw from sexuality and sex are possible. And I think most frequently by of a book by Keguro Macharia, frottage, and he uses frottage as a method, right, as a method to think about the frictions of identity formation in the Black diaspora, right? And so I suppose, yes, as a kind of a broader thing, perhaps I will admit publicly that I am invested in the recuperation of sodomy as a cultural concept that can be used beyond the designation of identifying homosexuality. Because I think part of the problem with that is that people are homosexuals and they also do not have same-sex sex, right? That it's possible to be a homosexual and not have sex with someone of the same sex, right? That has always been possible. And so what does that mean if same-sex acts becomes available to only signify sodomy? What does it mean for someone who might identify as homosexual, but as asexual, right? So, yes.
Well, that was a lovely answer, Thato. I actually, but I wanted to actually ask you something more specific within the early modern legal regimes. Now, I understand that you are, and I think it's a really poignant move in terms of an interesting methodological move in terms of trying to look at the instability and the productivity of the category of sodomy across this world. Now, but while listening to you, I was thinking of the counterpoint because it seems that the juridical is more stable when you are actually comparing it with the instability and the protean character of the sodomite. Now, but my little reading of the early modern legal world, for instance, Lauren Benton's plurality reading, the legal plural worlds, it would appear that state law, in the sense that we understand juridical contemporarily, or even from the late 18th, early 19th century, that's not decided. I mean, the fact that state law will win out in the end. It is competing with oceanic law, it's competing with municipality law. So there is a certain instability in what law is, in the legal regime, in the plural legal regime itself. So while I understand the instability and the protean nature of the sodomite being highlighted, at some level, I felt the legal regime itself is quite versatile at that point in time, in the making. So how does that change, or how does that particular literature, which kind of highlights the protean nature of the legal regime itself, the global legal regime, if you bring that in, what does it do to this methodological maneuver to the sodomite that you are actually carrying out?
So I mean, I think that's precisely what I am after here, right? That before the 1730 trials, there is this just openness, right, to this category, right? And so, which is why, by definition, the sodomite sins are any category of sin, and the sodomite is any individual who debases themselves, right into any of these categories, right? And so that the privileging of a kind of legal sensibility that produces a stable referent is part of what I'm trying to get at here, right? That the legal discourse in its stability obscures the kinds of cultural, social, economic, maritime, state, perhaps even. I think, I'm constantly thinking about the VOC as a state, right? Because the VOC itself, has territories, right? And so, this fluidity is what I am after, right? And so, just to say here that, in chapter 2 of this dissertation, I pursue sodomy as a racializing marker before race as a biological referent is available, right? So in the Cape, the West African enslaved people who arrived in the Cape in 1658 with the ship, the Amersfoort, are the focus of my second chapter. And there is a case which I will not divulge. Perhaps maybe in January or February, I will present another seminar where you can then hear the details of this case and my reading of it, and how sodomy becomes available as a language of racialization in the 17th century. And so that's precisely what this dissertation is about. The discourses, the very discourses that construct sodomy versus, or along with rather, the legal discourses.
Thanks. Thank you very much. I think I see it's already 2:01. Unless there is one last pressing comment or question anyone wants to make. I don't see any hands, but thank you so much, Thato, for joining us, and we'd love to have you back, and maybe January and February. I'll make that happen if you are available. And good luck. And again, thank you so much, everybody, for being here, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye.